Well, welcome Schuco and Tin Toy fans. This is the Tin Meister, and welcome to part 3 of our series on restoring and refurbishing the Schuco Combinato 4003. This is the actual car that we restored during the episodes you've been watching. Still running great. And in this final part of our series, we will be reassembling the car. So stay tuned. I'll be with you in a minute. Bye. So as we start the reassembling of the Combinato, remember we've done a lot of cleaning and rust removal, and now we take the chassis and put it up on a foam pad, as you can see here. And as we prepare the car for reassembly, we want to make sure all the tabs are in the correct position. So these two tabs need to be put up straight with your pliers. Make sure all the tabs are in good condition, that they're pointing straight up, and everything's ready for the assembly of your car. So we start with assembling the steering mechanism, and we put the wheels on, and there's a knuckle that's going to go into the little hole on the other side of that knuckle, and there's one on each side, one knuckle and wheel on each side. The reason we have it up on a foam pad is so that those wheels can kind of dangle there without getting caught on the work surface. So as you take another look at this, as you start assembling the steering assembly, there's a couple little points you need to look at, and that's where the steering rack and pinion, you might say, goes into the steering knuckles. You got to make sure they're in the correct position. And once all the pieces are in place, you take the part that we de-rusted and you fit it onto the steering knuckles and hold it down with your thumb. And then take your pliers and bend those tabs back a little bit, just enough to hold that cross piece in place, and so it doesn't move. And now we install the horn motor, and there's 3 tabs. There's 1, 2, and there's one you can't see, but it's hidden behind the motor back there. There's 3 tabs you got to put in. Now, a very important part is this little spring that's on the motor. That spring holds the steering column up so that when you press the horn down, it doesn't stay down, it springs back and the horn stops. So make sure that that is where I've just shown you, in front of that collar. Now we install the front bulkhead, and there's 2 tabs that we need to do. There's one, and then there's the other one on the other side, and those need to be bent straight up so you can get the front bulkhead on. Now remember, before you go much further, make sure all the rest of the tabs are bent up and straight so it's easy to put on the rest of the components. So now that the horn motor is in place, we should test it. So we want to wind it up and make sure we test. Remember, you're going to test every component as you put it together to make sure it's all operating correctly. And here we are. We're going to press down the button where the horn button is normally, and we're going to test the horn out and make sure it returns and stops and goes and all that. Next, we take the steering wheel and take the little copper or brass tube that fits inside the steering wheel and put it in there so it fits nicely. Very important part. There it is with the brass or copper tube all the way down inside the steering wheel. Then we take the steering wheel and we put it in place on the steering column. Make sure it's lined up. Make sure your wheels are lined up straight and the steering wheel is straight, so that when you start putting the final pieces together, they're all steering. When you have the steering wheel go straight, the steering is actually straight. Make sure it's all it fits right down onto the steering column nicely. And then there's kind of an interesting part. You need a solid surface. I have a steel pad that I use and a hammer, and we're going to drive the horn button on the steering column onto the steering column itself. So we hold the edge of the end of the steering column on the steel plate, And then we take that horn button and we drive it in so that it's snug in there. Remember, we wanted to make sure everything was straight. If it isn't, you're going to have to take some pieces apart and get that steering to move straight. And now we assemble the drive motor. We put it onto the chassis. And there's 4 tabs. There's one of them, but there's 4 tabs around the drive motor. Now, when you take the tabs here, you don't want to just bend them over. You want to just twist them slightly, enough to hold the motor in place. Again, there's the Schuco key, and we're testing the motor. Test, test, test before you do anything, before you go on to the next steps. Now the motor's in place, we can check out the shifter, make sure it's working properly, and all the gears. Neutral, first, second, third, and of course reverse. We test out the brake. Here's the brake right here. We're testing the brake. We're testing the steering to make sure it works. And again, test the horn, test the steering, and as you're doing the steering, test the shifter again. Test the horn. There we go. So take a look here. You can see how the car has gone together. You can see the tabs are twisted and not just bent over, and everything is in place and solid. I show these views so when you're starting to put your car together, you can refer to these so you can see how it should look. That wheel that fell off before, we've actually tested it on the axle, and it seemed to fit well, and then we actually use super glue. I don't use super glue very often, but that's a good example of when it comes into its own. We're taking again a look at the steering mechanism up in the front, make sure everything's okay, everything is solid, nothing's loose. So now that we have the chassis pretty much together, let's take a look at the body. And here's a little example of a dent on the corner of the car that we might be able to take out. And I do this occasionally. I use a couple of little tools. Here are some punches I use. Sometimes I use just a spoon. You can press a spoon up against the sheet metal, and sometimes it'll pop it right out. But be gentle, because you can really make a mess of it. Now we need to replace the taillights, so we have some new parts that we're going to use. We're going to test them in their place. So we put them together and fit them inside the car. So from the outside you push it into the back and make sure it fits nicely and everything's solid, of course. And then on the inside of the car you can see the plastic nub of that tail light sticking through. So what I do, I don't glue this, I do it like they did in the factory back in the day. I take a hot iron, sometimes I use a soldering iron, and I use that soldering iron to melt the plastic on the back of that tail light. And there's not a great picture, but that's what it looks like after I melted it on. So that's just kind of the way they did it back in the factory. Well, now that we have the taillight in place, let's take a look at putting a new windshield on. So we have a new part here, a new windshield, and we use the dash to set it in, and you'll see that in a moment. So we take the windshield and we put it up to the dash, and let the dash has 2 tabs on it that fit through the windshield. And we take that assembly. We haven't turned those tabs down yet. We take that assembly and we test fit it onto the body. See the 2 long slots there? That's where those tabs fit in. And we test it out, make sure it sits flat. Here we are. We've got our thumb holding it down. Oh no, that's my thumb or my finger. I'm not sure. And then from the back we have the 2 tabs, and again we twist them. We don't just push them down, we twist them just enough to hold it in place. The next thing is we want to put the seat back on, And this is the last part of the chassis we need to assemble. So the seat fits onto a couple little tabs or places where the tabs will fit, and one is on the motor and a couple of them are on the forward bulkhead. Here's the forward bulkhead. We've slid it in there, and then we need to actually bend these tabs down. And you need to bend the tabs down because there are some moving parts that will move past those tabs, and if they're not bent down correctly, the moving parts can get caught and then you won't be able to shift the car correctly. So here it is bent up. This one's bent up on the far side of the forward bulkhead. You can see some of those moving parts that'll just go right past it. And that should about finish up our chassis. So now we attach the speedometer and adjust it with the shifter to make sure it's pointing in the right direction. You can move it around. It's a tight fit, but you can move it around. So there's the speedometer on the axle there. And now we're ready to assemble the body onto the chassis. Sometimes I just hate to do this because we've done such great work, and you'll be very proud too of the work you've done. You kind of want to just look at the chassis. It looks so great. It's all clean, no rust. So we make sure everything fits. Those tabs that fit onto the body we bent up earlier are going to fit right onto the body, from the chassis to the body. Everything fits correctly, and we put those 3 screws in. The one in the front we just saw, and there's the 2 in the back. And we're just about done. What are we doing now? We're testing again. Make sure everything works great. It probably will at this point. We've tried everything a couple different times. We've tested and tested. And if it doesn't, you can easily take the body off. And you guys know how to do that by now. Now we're testing the brake again. And we clean it up one more time with our microfiber towel. And we've got a finished product. Look at the difference from the early days to this car right now. Isn't that great, you guys? And you can do the same thing. Now, I don't paint the cars, and you can see there's a couple scratches, but I call that patina. And I really like to have the original Schuco paint on the car. It just makes a world of difference to me. It's like a real car, you know. If you've got an old vintage car, if you have the original paint, even though it's got some nicks in it, it's a lot better, I think, than having a full go painted Concours car. It just adds a patina and history to the car. So there we go, you guys, and there is your finished product. It'll work great for years to come. So that concludes our restoration and refurbishment of the Combinato 4003. I hope you guys really enjoyed this. I enjoyed putting it together for you. And I think we're going to have a little epilogue. We'll take a short video of a before and after pictures of our Combinato. If you've got any questions, please let me know. If you liked it, please give me a thumbs up. And if you can, please subscribe. Thanks, Schuco fans. See you next time.